So some grant budget and narrative examples. In the proposal and in all proposals, you not only have a grant budget that's requested, which shows this line item budget, but granting organizations, really any organization wants to know, what are you doing with the money? They need some narrative. They don't just want to see numbers on a page. How does the expense that you're asking for accomplish some sort of output to reach an outcome, going back to those figures that we just took a look at? So I think I'll start with, let's see, budget narrative. So if we take a look recently, each year, as you can see here, Utah State University Extension has these extension grants. And essentially this call has not changed for quite some time. They may tweak some of the wording, or they did tweak the dollar amount. I think in 2016 it went up to, maybe it was 2017, went from $10,000 to $30,000 that could be asked for. So they'll tweak a few of these things, but if you're part of USU Extension, you can kind of count on there being some funding available each year in these grant requests. So grant application submission, due dates, the reviewer application, the call for proposal, and the guidelines. So you would open this up, and this is what's going to show you what's being required in this particular grant. And it's, gives you kind of the eligibility and then the things that you should include, which should look very familiar to the proposal you're developing in this class. Cover page with this information. It should include in this order an introduction, a review of the literature, your objectives, your procedures, an evaluation plan, anticipated outputs and outcomes. So I haven't been making these words up all semester, neither is your text. These are the actual things being required in this RFP, request for proposal from Extension, that will be submitted, I believe, for up to $30,000 in here. Plans about how the proposed project will be sustained. Where's the sustainability here? Plans for dissemination. Describe the collaborators' roles, a detailed budget narrative that justifies your proposed expenses by expenditure category, and then use this template, which is essentially the spreadsheet for showing us the lines, the actual line item budget. Two things then, detailed budget narrative, and then a template that would be the actual line item. And so those are the things in order that they want to see within this proposal. Goes on to ask, give out some other specific details about submission and due dates and so forth. That's a pretty small RFP. Some RFPs I've seen can be as many as 10 or 12 pages, but this is inside of USU for Extension. It's very targeted funding, so this is all that is required essentially to get this money spent out in a way that they deemed appropriate for the outcomes and the outputs that they hope to see happen in Extension. So going back to that grant page, then that's what they have for the call for proposal, and then the budget template looks just like what you've probably seen inside of your text, with just putting out a table with the actual items. Let's see if we can get this opened up here. Yes, so here they have, let's see now, let's blow that up a little bit. Graduate student support, fringe benefits. Remember that was an hourly person, so it's only 8%. Any kind of insurance that you're going to be maybe covering, undergraduates, if they're involved, technical personnel, fringe benefits for those sort of folks is at that 46%. And then subtotals for salaries here, salaries and benefits. Interestingly, I want you to notice this. They have the benefits on one line, and then they also have what the salary is here, but they will get added together so that you see the salary and benefits. And that's oftentimes what an accountant wants to see, is how much are we spending on that. Then these other direct costs are listed under there, such as in-state travel, material, supplies, equipment, and other, and then you get this total budgetary amount that you are requesting. This is not a narrative. This is the budget template. This is the table. So if you just supply this in the proposal in this class without a narrative about why you need the funds for each one of the items in these categories, you're not going to get funded because they don't know why you need that money. I hope that makes a lot of sense. So let me get back over there. That is a quick look then at a local extension grant, and I'm going to bring over a previous application that Denise Stewartson shared with me. And just so you can see, there it is laid out exactly with what was required: the introduction, a review of the literature over several pages, an evaluation plan, the anticipated outputs and outcomes. You could put a logic model in here and it would make sense to the reviewers very quickly to see what you're going to do. It wasn't required, but it gets at it because it uses those terms and it might visually make it easier for them to follow what you want to do. Role of the graduate and undergraduate students, future funding, this is the sustainability piece, and now the budget narrative, which is where I wanted to get to. Here it says the majority of the funding received from this grant will go toward purchasing of equipment and supplies. In this case, it's not salaries and benefits. And then it spells out 48 incubators are going to be bought for the Cache, Davis, Utah, and Iron County school districts. That's going to total $6,000. This has hopefully been backed up in the literature above, but it could add another statement here that says this will help to further the hatching chicks in a classroom program. It is required that they also have 48 brooder kits. And so there's the narrative there. I think this is pretty point by point. You could probably have just one more thing linking back to what it is that your program goals are. But I just want you to see that the narrative is in narrative. Goes on, there's the budget template, which was exactly what we just saw, and then a references page. So that's a pretty tidy, that's their exact budget page. That's a pretty tidy proposal, and this was funded. Renewal request, this is, they sent this around for a renewal. Let's take a look at another way. So I submit funds to USDA for a contract, and because this is a multi-year contract, I put my narrative in a table like this. And this is pretty small print, especially when you get out to year 1, 2, 3, 4 years. But just so that I could track the history of this, I put down in a narrative. This was also required in a separate table, but just so they could easily see, this is what that person's going to be doing, and this is their salary, these are their benefits, as you can see, the rate that they have. There's going to be an anticipated 3% cost of living that was accounted for. There's a benefit package of 46%, which was what we were told to have for that particular year. And so my narrative on this particular contract was put into a table just for the purpose of tracking, but it's there, it's spelled out specifically what it is, and if this fits what you're doing, you could put a narrative like this and then also have your line items out to the side. It does get a little confusing for the accountants. They don't really love it, and that I'm mentioning this because this was an addendum. That was the justification. This was the narrative, but I also was required to submit the table like you saw in the previous example. And so each one of these is out. There's the category of travel. Those are all the meetings, other direct costs, materials and supplies. And that's a pretty big list of items, equipment, and that kind of resource. And you can see that each year that's basically about $400,000. All right. So that's some good examples there of what it might look like for a narrative and that line item budget. One more example I'm going to pull over right here. This is actually the application from grants.gov to NIFA at USDA for the grant I just showed you. And so this is when I hear of a grant funding opportunity, I go to grants.gov and I'll talk about this, I think, in week 15 or 14, can't remember, some different funding opportunities. But when you download a package from grants.gov, you get a PDF file that looks like this, and you are asked to put in each one of these different links, the data related to that project. And so let's see if I can blow this up just a little bit. So this was one of the last ones that I did, and just to go right here, you can see that there's key personnel, other project information, research and related budget, research and related personnel data, project performance, and other supplemental information. And within that, they're going to ask for all of the narrative pieces that you just saw in the extension example. But let's take a look then at the related budget so you can see what that looks like. There we go. Pull that over. I think we can get it all on there. You not only have to have a narrative where it's right here, at the very bottom where you add the attachment, but you still have to have this table, which is the formulation of the line item. You know, what's the requested salary? what are the fringe benefits, and then the total funds requested. That's a pretty nice and clean way to do it, going across salary for that individual, their benefit package, and then the total, and then you have this nice column running down the outside. So in addition to that little narrative kind of all colored sheet that I just showed you that went in as the narrative, they want to see this. This is the accountants now. They want to see this dollar for dollar so they can account for each dollar of federal funding. So you can add attachments at each juncture. If you've asked for equipment, additional personnel get added here. But that's essentially what a package looks like on grants.gov for anything, a National Science Foundation, EPA grant, this is a USDA grant. They've all have these same forms and require the same sort of information in the same sort of format. So that's just another way to show it to you. Right here is, there it is, the budget narrative for renewal. I added this attachment, and that was that all colored sheet that you had, and it was referenced in the main narrative of the proposal. All right, this video is getting a little long, but we are covering 2 chapters, and it's kind of, there's some complexities here that aren't discussed inside of the chapter. So when you look at Table 12.2 and Table 12.3, they then say, they just basically look at that return on investment in terms of immediate outputs and what it costs for those units of service, and that there's good examples in there. I think that's easy to follow, and oftentimes funders want to know that data. The accountants want to know that line, where was it spent? But the folks and the stakeholders want this kind of information. And they want this one here on below it, the intermediate outcomes. How many successfully achieving the objectives at individual, in this case, case plans? What was the final outcome? They're really interested in what that return on investment per participant was. But you can't begin to calculate these 2 items without having that line item budget. And that will come later. Oftentimes they're asking for that when you're doing the reporting. Chapter closes with the idea that sometimes you need to plan for a budget increase and sometimes you're planning for a decrease. And they give you several examples about how to deal with both situations. Obviously, one is just everybody across the board is going to take an increase, or everybody's going to take a decrease. Or we're going to more strategically look at it in terms of planning, going back to those 3 models and way to look at budgeting. And we're going to look at our programs and see which ones should be decreased more, and maybe keeping the other ones that are absolutely essential services at the same level. And that's really just making some decisions if you have some good data and have tracked those kinds of outputs and outcomes related to your financial spending. All right, developing a line item and functional program budgets then, Chapter 13. Just a few things here. Regardless of the type of budget you decide to use, they all begin with the line item budget. I've probably said that 5 times. The line item functional and program budgeting systems. Again, this chapter reviews those concepts and gives you specific examples. They talk about developing the line item budget. They look at determining the agency's programming structure to figure out how to spread the indirect cost pool and that kind of thing. They talk about creating a cost allocation plan format. They look at identifying the direct and indirect costs, of which I have discussed with you now in a little bit more concrete example, hopefully. And then assigning the direct cost to programs that are using more and indirect costs into that indirect cost pool. And then finally allocating the indirect costs to programs and determining that program's total cost. So you have to look at everything. You can't just say, oh, we got that as a freebie. No, it always costs something and it needs to be accounted for in your budgeting scheme. In terms of the budget narrative, summing up here, especially as you look at your proposals, be sure to look at your logic model outputs, activities. These will have associated costs. If you have an activity, I'm going to be looking at that. If you have an activity, but you haven't accounted for it in the budget, in that budget narrative or in that budget justification, then I'm going to say, how are you going to pay for this? You said you were doing this in your narrative. You have this as an activity or an output, but it's not in your budget. So make sure that you're looking at those 2 things. A table of figures is not a narrative or a budget justification. It's just the table, and it's really just for accounting purposes. So you need to add that narrative as either a paragraph form, or you could put it with mine was covering multiple years, you could have a justification and just put the amounts out to the side. So it's clear as somebody's reading the narrative what they're going to see in the table. And you saw that in the one for the hatching chicks where she discussed, we're going to do this bracket, $6,000. There's just a couple of ways to deal with that. So it's very clear what each one of those outputs is going to cost. You can add narrative to the figures, or you can keep them separate, as I've mentioned, as long as it's easy to determine in the narrative for what you actually have as expenses. All right, check to see what's required by the funding agency before you begin, and that's if you are, in this case, I haven't specifically said you're applying for a specific grant, but that is something you really want to look at before you start, so that you know what, if they are only allowing $50,000 requests, then your program has to cost less than that. You have to account for the benefit package, and you have to account for any F&A costs that will not go over their threshold of what they're willing to provide. And you'll see these two terms, RFA, request for application, or request for proposal. They're actually fairly similar, but proposal is meaning oftentimes is used where there's a little bit of the process is just tell us what your idea is. Just send us a proposal. We could maybe find money, but usually RFA is we have a specific amount. It's more like a contract, and this is what you're going to have. But they're used somewhat interchangeably as you look out online. Okay, that wraps up my 40-minute conversation on budget for those two chapters. Hit pause if you need to, but or stop and come back and view this thing. But these are some of the more important concepts related to budget and financial control for chapters 12 and 13.